Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Newton, and today I will be discussing white privilege and the impact on supervision. Unfortunately, my co-host is not available. However, I will move forward with the presentation today. So as we get started, we're going to be looking at what is white privilege, what is the impact on individual supervision, the impact on group supervision, the impact in leadership, advocacy, and education. Looking at white privilege on an individual level, Bernard 2019 describes privilege or conferred dominance, refers to unearned privilege of most European American therapists. On the community level, we'll be looking at marginalized groups that are forced to adapt to white European American behavioral patterns. And the systemic level looks at white supremacists and their hypocrisy in their rejected views, the stereotypes, the victim blaming, institutional and educational racism. Ethnocentric monoculturalism is defined by Sue as a dysfunction in a pluralistic society. It's defined as the individual, the institution, and the cultural expression of the belief in superiority of one's group cultural heritage, noted as a combination of cultural racism and cultural encapsulation. Collins and Lodge emphasize the intersectionality as a framework where they observe white privilege to address the following: power complexity, social equality, social context, social justice, and relationality. Then Oldbach reviewed two principles: the new racism. In the event that marginalized groups succeed, the rules must be changed. And racial exclusivity, and assimilation. Gosh, I can't get my words out today. So as we look at areas of supervision and exploration, we're going to, again, review that individual level, the community, and systemic. The locus of control and responsibility, also noted by Sue Atwell, refers to the internal locus of control. And these are things that we can control with our own actions. External locus are things in the future or chances of luck. And the locus of responsibility is looking at the blame as it falls on the individual in the system. Internal locus of control is the control of our own actions, and the internal locus of responsibility. Internal locus of control, again, really looks at our own actions and the things that we can control. And so an example here is if a counselor were to say cultural oppression in therapy becomes an ever-present danger. This person is looking at self-reliance and equal access to opportunity, where the client is not usually accepted by marginalized individuals and not really suited for non-white cultures. When looking at the external locus and the internal locus, we're really looking at chance and individual responsibility. So this kind of forms like a matrix where we have a choice of which we want to apply and how we want to accept world perceptions. So if a counselor fails to recognize the external factors of racism and cultural oppression in society, then they're really looking at, or they're accepting that locus of control as being external, and they take no responsibility. And for a client, marginalized individuals, they accept the dominant culture, and they do feel powerless. The external locus of control and the external locus of responsibility identify chance, or combine chance and the system as a whole. So in this particular instance, a white European therapist would be highly structured with rules and regulations with little room for error. However, the greater understanding is the political influences in this particular case. And for the client, it would be a mild disassociation, inferiority, and it's accepting that certain behaviors are expected or stereotypes. Finally, we should have the internal locus, looking at our own actions along with the system itself. So here we have a conscious counselor who is familiar with the racial identities and a greater acceptance of cultural diversity. And the client is conscious of racial identities as well, especially their own. When we look at ethnocentric monoculturalism, there are 5 main components. And so here we're looking at the belief in superiority, the belief in inferiority. And then we look at the white European Americans possess the power to impose the standards and beliefs on marginalized groups. And they also have the opportunity to reject the differential or the unequal statuses, enable the oppression, and continue the prejudice, bias, and attitudes. White European American values and beliefs are also manifested in programs, policies, practices, and structures. And this is definitely on that institutional level. Institutional racism encourages oppression. Discriminatory practices, statutes, selective enforcement of laws, blocking economic opportunities, and imposing assimilation, as well as denying multiculturalism. Worldviews of dominant groups represent an invisible veil of power, of source of control. It lacks conscious awareness. Social conditioning leads to the misinformation related to the marginalized groups, discrimination, and the power of racism. So here we get to, how does this impact individual supervision? So when we have let's say for instance, a white supervisor who chooses to look at their locus of control as external, and they have no control over the perceptions of society, then they in turn can perpetuate those stereotypes as well as impose European-based beliefs. So for instance, the head wrap that I have on right now, this may be, my supervisor could approach me and say that this isn't appropriate to be in supervision, or that my dress is not appropriate. They could, a white supervisor could attack my personal characteristics, my appearance. However, my head wrap is not an influence of how I can build a therapeutic relationship or connection with an individual. In the role of supervision, as a supervisor, there already comes a a level of hierarchy, because certainly I have an educational background, or the supervisor would have an educational background, which does put them in the position of control and dominance. And so as they're in that position of control and dominance, and I'm seeking their approval, then I may internalize the feedback that is given. Then we also have the historical multiculturalism. And so when we are looking at the historical multiculturalism and the lack thereof in American society, then the supervisor has the ability to open up to me to ask, what are my thoughts? What are my beliefs? What are my values? Or the supervisor also has the option to impose or expect for me to wholeheartedly accept theirs. So when we look at, again, supervision and the characteristics, then we have racial identity. And there are many levels of racial identity for different cultural backgrounds and experiences. Racial identity, I could have a racial identity of wanting to accept and embrace all African culture based on my heritage, based on DNA, based on information that was provided from my parents or grandparents. However, there are also individuals who may not accept those. And so my racial identity as a supervisee definitely has to be identified, and it is of benefit for a supervisor to discuss racial identity and where exactly I fall in my racial identity as a supervisee. Now, white privilege may also show up in feelings of guilt, defensiveness, anxiety, and shame. And these can also be detrimental to my multicultural developmental competencies. So as I move forward in my program, and I have the expectation, well, actually not me, but the accrediting bodies such as KCREP would have the expectation for my white supervisor to encourage me to be more open to people of other ethnic backgrounds. However, if my supervisor is not able to identify their own feelings of guilt, and those come out in the form of defense or anxiety or shame, then me as a supervisee, I'm not experiencing the growth that I potentially could. So when we look at the maintenance and the interaction, the matrix in the interaction between client and therapist, as well as therapist, supervisor, and supervisee, then we can see how there can be many levels of influence. The role of supervision and the power dynamic. Here we really look at the that seniority mentality, or that dominance based on education and experience. And so it is important for the supervisee to always it's important for the supervisor to always monitor the supervisee, but also monitor their own appropriateness. So here we explore the supervision and the historical multiculturalism. So as we discussed earlier, there are 5 major areas of ethnocentric monoculturalism. So here we're going to look at the contradictions. 5 contradictions from the historical aspect include the fact that European men were not receiving adequate representation and support in Europe, and they came to the United States. Well, in that process of them escaping oppression, they in turn began to enslave individuals. So while they were escaping oppression, they began to inflict it. The Declaration, which still stands and is observed to the present day, the Declaration of Independence, that completely excluded women from the from the population of the United States. That document was not written to include women, nor non-European men. Technically, at that time, they were immigrants themselves. Another major contradiction, again, this is a reiteration of the first one, which was the experience of oppression and their attempt to escape it, but then they began to inflict the oppression themselves. Another area is that most United States textbooks, when they reference the historical events of the United States, they often ignore that white European Americans were not natives of the country, but they were immigrants themselves. And here is also the escape of oppression and really discounting the roles of their oppression, the persecution, and the oppression that was inflicted amongst the natives of this country. So here we look at the impact of leadership. So 70.6% of U.S. counselors are white, and 73.3% are female. Therefore, it's safe to assume that the majority of counselor supervisors in the United States are white, female, and middle class, as well as English speaking. As supervisors in this group, they have the ability to dictate acceptable counseling behaviors, minimizing diverse approaches, and restrict access to the profession, which historically has oppressed identities, values, and perspectives, as well as healing traditions. So again, just as the example that I provided, if my supervisor were to say that my headscarf was not appropriate, then I would be inclined to accept her perspective and not challenge her, because she is not only in the role of dominance, but she is also somebody whose approval I'm seeking. Supervisees will not become culturally effective until the supervisors are more culturally sensitive. So this is a reiteration that if my supervisor is not encouraging me to be more open and expand my perceptions of other cultures, then this is going to perpetuate and is going to continue, especially if a white supervisor is supervising a white counselor, then that, expansion of multiculturalism and diversity is not present. In terms of leadership, we'll be looking at effective monitoring, positive monitoring, and the need to cross racial mentoring. So when looking at the impact of advocacy, social justice is very much needed in today's society. And with the awareness of systemic oppression, plus the commitment to social action, it is visible that counselor efforts are needed to ensure that all clients get equitable access to resources, opportunities, and life outcomes. Supervisees and when looking at this dynamic, we have supervisees and we have client liberation. We also have the transformation of the profession, as well as greater social justice opportunities arise overall. We have, we hope that advocacy can be adaptable to any supervisory theory, supervisory developmental model, as well as the supervisory process model. So here we look at how each of these roles really overlap and where they meet, as well as the different stages. So when looking at the social justice model, we have the supervisor who should engage in the self-evaluation, and that's really where they do, true self-reflection and see where they can expand in different areas of counselor development. It's important for the supervisee to really explore their own identity and where they are, where they fall on the racial identity model that is that was published in Sue Etwell's counseling in. I'm sorry, I completely lost the name of that textbook. But it's but he does, Sue Etwell, they have a chapter that really dedicates the levels of racial identity. And so it's important for supervisees of all ethnic backgrounds and all races to really be in touch with where they are and the growth that they make while they're engaging in advocacy. Stage 3, supervisors, they teach social justice and social justice systems. Stage 4, supervisor and supervisee, they process the social justice work. So the social justice model for counselor supervision, it takes action beyond multiculturalism. And they really bring the social justice skills and the attitudes toward those that they encounter, both other counselors as well as clients. Here we'll look at the impact on education. As we look at white privilege, again, we come across these words, guilt, anxiety, and shame. And then we also have to look at the crossroads and how they come together. Intersectionality, the purpose is to challenge individuals to change patterns, to work against social inequalities, and to enhance students' critical thinking. Intersectionality is also the point or the place where individuals are not protected or supported in past theories, as well as education, scholarship, and research, where there's a group that's pretty much left at a crossroad, but still without support. So how do we dismantle white privilege and supervision? We have to increase our multicultural competence, which does include learning more about other cultures, as well as self-reflection and looking at our ability to embrace those other cultures. Next, we really have to look at openness and acceptance of diversity, shared experiences, cultural identity again, behaviors and interventions. I have to explore feelings amongst supervisees, as well as supervisors, review the relationship, as well as the communication amongst the two. So does anyone have any questions at this time?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
My question would be, in dealing with, in thinking of white privilege, if you are the counselor and you see that your client exhibits some, for lack of a better word, symptoms or feature, or someone that may feel like they have a privilege, how would you best address that?
If a counselor encountered a client that presented signs of privilege,
Right.
yeah. I would say that that would first need to be addressed with the conversation of accepting the cultural differences, to engage in a session with between the therapist and the client, to really explore that, you know, there are some cultural differences that are here, and I hope that we could have a strong communication and a strong relationship where we can discuss concerns and things that are hurtful, or things that may exceed boundaries that we're both comfortable with. And so boundaries are important in all counseling relationships, and change and growth comes through communication. So first there has to be a discussion and acknowledgement that there are differences in experiences, in expectations, and cultural identity as well.
And another question I had was that, and do you think that those that may have a privilege often may not understand or know that they have that privilege because it's a norm for them, and it's easy to recognize when you don't have a privilege. So the African Americans may see something where they're being not treated the same, you know, and that may be our norm. And someone who's used to having those things may not even understand, you know, how we would feel. So do you think that oftentimes that those with white privilege may not understand or may not even know that they have a privilege?
Certainly, definitely. And I'm not sure that that privilege is really oh, made aware until there is a certain level of exposure to experiences, understanding what a person has been through. If I'm not aware that that you drug 10 bags across the street, you know, just to help me out, then I don't know what your plight was. I don't know what exactly you did to, you know, I don't know what exactly you went through or encountered to get there. And so it does require that, you know, that communication, the shared experience, but it does also take open-mindedness as well. And so the only way to make progress is for all parties to be open in sharing, as well as open in receiving.
I have a question. I thought that was a great question, so it kind of led me to this as well. I put it in the chat a bit, but so on the same note, how do you assist the supervisee in learning to kind of self-regulate, so to self-recognize when they are displaying, you know, white privilege, or not acknowledging the privilege in a way that they can take that when they're not under supervision, if that makes sense at all?
I believe that you're asking how can we help the supervisee to acknowledge and act on their privilege if they don't see it?
Yeah, and more so how we can teach them to do that when we're not there, if that makes sense.
That is really going to fall in when we do have those encounters, pointing out those encounters, those interactions, you know, having open discussions when you are with them. And I think, you know, I think the most accurate analogy, I guess I could say, is, you know, how do we expect for our clients to continue interventions outside of the counseling session? Well, that comes from providing knowledge, psychoeducation, and counseling. And so when it comes to white privilege, then it really requires that education, the awareness of social justice, the discussion of inequality, the discussion of historical aspects, you know, just like some of the things that were discussed, like the textbook and slavery not being mentioned in some textbooks, you know, and to take that history from the experiences of other non-white groups or, people of ethnic backgrounds. So it really, really comes in that conversation and really exploring those things when you have the encounter with the supervisee. And the hope is that they continue not only to identify those things while you guys are together, and as the supervision relationship grows, then they can even bring things to you, but also as time goes on, then they'll be able to see it when they're out in public and actually be advocates, being advocates not only in the counseling session, not only being advocates in, with their counselor hat on, but being advocates in everyday society. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and and thinking of everything as a whole, and with the movement and the identifying of all the problems that plague our society right now, I think that in dealing with white privilege and counseling, I think that it definitely opens up a lot of avenues for discussion. I feel as though, as an African American male, in our community, we don't have as many counselors, or we don't often identify with the mental health component of treatment as others may do. I just think that identifying our differences and also our similarities will just afford growth in our communities that will aid us in uniting and solving some problems that have been plaguing our society for a long period of time.
I totally agree. And the Black community has held certain perceptions of mental health, and of receiving mental health services, support, therapy. There has definitely been a stigma that was associated with mental health services. There still is at times the perception that things can be handled within the home. But, when you even go back to slavery and looking at that, the encounter or the experiences during slavery, we as Black individuals were not able to access, certain things like healthcare. And so it was taught by my grandmother's grandmother that you don't ask for help. We handle things right here. And so when my grandmother's grandmother heard that and she learned that, then she taught that to my grandmother, and my grandmother taught that to my mom, and my mom taught that to me. So it's something that goes back so far, where it could simply be perceived as Black people are not interested in mental health. But there is also the even not going as far back as slavery, but even more recently, the lack of trust that's been built, or the lack of trust, or the trust that has been dismantled or interrupted with healthcare in general, and Black Americans with experiments such as the Tuskegee experiment. When you look at I'm perceiving doctors as being the helpful source, but then the helpful source, I know this man down in Tuskegee, and he was injected with the disease, and they were, in essence, they were science projects. And so how do we trust the healthcare and mental health if this is the relationship that's been built, where I'm being essentially, used as a guinea pig, or even in today's society, Black women in labor, Black women have the highest death rate in childbirth. And that there are studies as recent as the last 5 years that show white physicians do not respond or acknowledge the concern of pain amongst the Black community equally. And so, if I'm pregnant and I'm telling my doctor that something isn't right, then, and my doctor doesn't acknowledge my pain, here I am again. This is it's continuing the lack of trust, with the medical field, and then it's almost supporting what was taught to my great 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 grandmother in the slavery context, which is that we don't get health care. And that continues even today, where I can even say personally, I have not wanted my grandmother to go to a particular hospital because I didn't feel like she would come out alive, because I've known so many family members that have passed away in that particular hospital. But how do you tell a 85-year-old woman not to go to the hospital that she's only known her whole life? So but that confidence is not there in the medical field, and that spills over to mental health as well.
And I think we're saying that, I think that, sometimes that the broader scope is it goes into what you have experienced. And I think that sometimes, even though those are all facts and, the same experiences as as an African-American female that you experienced, and I'm sure that, my mother or, my cousins that are females may have experienced the same thing. I do think that sometimes, though, with those experiences, they intermingle with emotions, and we often assume that everybody has that same knowledge of our plight, and then we assume that things are understood when they're not. And just with my kids' generation, they don't know as much information about the racial experiences being what they were in the 70s or the 60s or the 50s. However, trying to educate them on those things, they don't see a direct correlation at times with how it relates to now. But I think, again, the education of one's experiences can definitely afford someone else an opportunity to not sympathize, but empathize with you and try to understand and view it from your situation. And oftentimes they're not, then we also have to view it from a different situation so everybody can be on one accord.
Definitely. I agree wholeheartedly. And that's where, platforms such as this come into play. The racial trauma groups, they come into play. And having the having the support of your counterparts as counselors is so very important, because if I have a classmate and that classmate shares an experience with me and I gain empathy to their experience, then I have the opportunity to pass that information along, whether it be passing it along to my child or passing it along to another cohort. That once I'm aware, and the only way to be proactive is to pass that knowledge along. And in regards to the children today, I think that that's an area that we definitely need groundbreaking input from all counselors on how we can better support our teenagers in the world of social media, in the world of the internet, in the world of get everything right now, right here, right now. We need input from each and every counselor who's willing to pour into the counseling profession to gain better methods that we call interventions to reach the adolescents that, they're definitely in a world of right here, right now. And historical content and historical culture are not important because everything is immediate. We're in an immediate culture where everything is right now. If your phone isn't fast enough, your pictures aren't sending, your paper doesn't download, if you can't get overnight shipping, these are, the food has to be heated up the fastest. And, so everything is like right now in this moment. And that takes to me, in my opinion, that takes the value of patience and the value of struggle. It decreases that value, as we live in an immediacy type of society. And so our children don't see the value in patience, then they don't see the value in hard work and things like that. And so the interventions that we have, Freud wasn't dealing with somebody who had access to social media. Erickson wasn't dealing with somebody who was being bullied, who was being cyber bullied, or Piaget wasn't looking at sex trafficking. These are things that were not concerns when what we call our founding fathers of counseling, when they created these interventions and these methods of building rapport and of effective counseling. They didn't have this type of adversity, in society, and certainly not as parents. And I think that's something else that may, potentially be interesting. How many of these gentlemen actually had kids? And when we look at counseling right now and the time that we have to put into our schoolwork, how many of them were involved fathers? Because we know that, having a child and being in a child's life and being present is something so different. Nonetheless, when we look at Carl Rogers, Erickson, Freud, Piaget, we look at all these individuals who poured in and created theories. They weren't facing the things that we're facing today. So that's why we need counselors like you and I today to create more effective methods to get through to the adolescent society. And then in addition, we could also serve as everyday advocates to decrease or dismantle, white privilege, whether it's intended or unintended, to decrease the white privilege so that maybe one day it doesn't have to be a discussion. Maybe one day it doesn't have to be, talked about that I have to watch my son closer than the average white parents have to watch their child because my son can be, attacked just from being a Black male, or that, something were to happen to him, and God forbid anything were to happen to him, that justice, does not get served just because of his skin color. Maybe one day, and that's what, Martin Luther King said, maybe one day I could be judged by the content of my character and not the color of my skin. Unfortunately, we are still there, and I'm still judged by the color of my skin. I still get followed around, or the long looks or hard stares. Regardless of, they're not asking my level of education before they're assuming, just as there was no question of Eric Garner's level of education or Breonna Taylor's level of education, George Floyd's level of education, Mike Brown, Freddie Gray, like all of these, Castile, all of these people who have passed away, it was not a question of what they knew, what they were doing. It was an immediate, you are guilty because you have more melanin in your skin. Immediate. And the person who rolled up on site was the judge, the juror, and the executioner. And so we have to be advocates, as counselors. We have, I think it was RABT. Gosh, what is his name? I just lost his name. RABT. Gosh. Okay. Well, the theorist that that created Albert. Gosh, I can see his name. The theorist that created RABT. He actually, said that we as counselors have the greatest influence because we have the opportunity to encourage somebody and offer somebody a different perspective. And so when somebody comes in saying they're feeling bad, they're looking toward us to change their minds, That is what they have come in for. That is their goal. 1000% is for us to change their minds about how they feel about themselves and how they feel about their day-to-day life. They're not coming in for us to do a surgery or to replace anything, or they are coming in for us to change their minds. And so as counselors, we have the ability to also change people's minds on white privilege. We have the ability to change people's minds on social inequality and and really calling out bias on the individual level. When you're working with a client one-on-one and somebody presents a situation where they may be implying white privilege, we have the opportunity to change their mind. On a community level, we have the opportunity to change the mindsets of organizations that we go out and that we consult for. And when we see the injustice or the inequalities in healthcare, or the inequalities in the school testing, inequalities in the teachers and discipline and AP class placement and historical not historical, but advanced placement, AP, and gifted and talented. We as counselors have the opportunity to provide influence, to say to a teacher, hey, I think you left Johnny Boy here out, because I really think that he deserves to be in the gifted and talented class as well. Because from what I see, and it's in his lack of placement should not be based on his skin color. And we have the opportunity to change on an institutional level by being lobbyists, by voting, by calling out or identifying when we have Albert Ellis. Thank you, Kevin. Albert Ellis. He pointed out that we have the greatest influence and that we can change the minds of individuals, and that also includes on the institutional level, where we are on school boards, or we're at schools, or we're on jobs, and or in politics, and we see these issues and we address them, we call them out, we be bold, we be honest, we be respectful, but we also be advocates for disadvantaged groups. Well, guys, that is my time. And thank you guys for listening. I appreciate you guys for showing up. And I hope that everybody enjoyed it. And if anybody comes across any questions at a later time, feel free to send those over to Colleen. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.